mostly about risk assessments and assessment of youth and understanding what makes them tick and how to begin to treat them. Where I first want to start, though, is etiology. I want to explain what causes a youth to become a sex offender. And there's lots of theories about this. I'm just going to mention a few of them that I think are useful. So to start off with, there's post-traumatic stress disorder. In resolving post-traumatic stress disorder, when someone's been traumatized, especially when they're small, they frequently act out what was done to them as a means of trying to understand it. If you look in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, you'll see that that's in there. There are some other theories, but I want to go through them in a little more detail. Addiction's one. Sexual addiction, brought up by Patrick Carnes, has been a more recent theory. And the idea of addiction is that you increase your interest in something, you're meeting a need or coping with stress or anxiety in an inappropriate way, be it alcohol, drugs, or sexual behavior. This looks more applicable to adults than to juveniles. But it's an interesting theory because people increase in what they do, and some of the offenders do that, even the juveniles. The psychodynamic theories deal with unconscious desires and drives. Attachment theory would focus on the fact that kids don't feel well attached, and so they reach out to children or to peers for attachment, frequently in an inappropriate way. Social learning theory would emphasize that they learned by watching what was done to them or by videos or something along those lines. And cognitive behavioral traumagenic would be they're trying to understand what's going on in their mind with post-traumatic stress disorder, and in working through those thoughts and feelings, they frequently will act out. So let's start with trauma in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the 5th version. So you'll see in the slides that I've got a copy of the cover of the 5th one, which has just come out. And these are the diagnoses, the criteria rather, and they're not a whole lot different than they were previously. There's a little bit of difference. One of the differences we thought would show up is 2 or 3 different kinds of post-traumatic stress disorder, but the people that argued at the table didn't like that. The way the DSM works is that people literally sit around a table, and unfortunately it's frequently rectangular, believe it or not, which is a bad way to negotiate. And there's psychiatrists and social workers and all kinds of other people, psychologists sitting around, and they look at studies and they say, okay, this is what needs to be in it. And sometimes the loudest voice wins. Then they write it up, they send it out for a trial to clinicians like yourselves, and you go out and you look at it, you try to use it, you see if it works or it doesn't, see how to adjust it, and then they write it back up and figure out how it works. So that's how the diagnoses get determined. So basically, the first thing is that someone was exposed to a threatened death, an actual or threatened serious injury, or threatened sexual violence, which is one of the nice things that was added, was sexual violence, because people began to recognize that PTSD occurred with sexual violence, not just in war or car accident, things like that. So that was one of the nice additions. And you can go through the criteria on the slide and read them for yourselves. The second criterion, B, is that you have intrusive symptoms. So you have reoccurring symptoms. You feel like it's happening to you again. If you think about small accidents in your own lives, perhaps a car accident, the next few days in your life, you'll start kind of remembering that crunchy sound, or you'll start remembering the sound of the brakes, and you'll remember it over and over again with decreasing frequency usually, and with less duration each time for several days until the experience is resolved and you've integrated it into your own mind and emotions in a calm way. This can take a week, this can take years, depending on what the event is. It can be quite serious, right? And that's what post-traumatic stress disorder is these intruding thoughts after experiencing some difficult trauma. And then the next thing, of course, that you want to avoid those feelings. You want to avoid that recollection. You do everything you can. And so this is a problem for treatment. If you want to treat someone who's been traumatized, they don't want to talk about trauma. They don't want to deal with it. Why would they? It was a terrible experience. And it's something that we all need to remember in working with trauma is that people want to avoid it. The key to that, which we'll talk about in a few classes, is to not talk about what actually happened, but to talk about the feelings that they're having currently in the current time. That's the way all schools, including psychodynamic schools, have moved to working with traumas. Work with the symptoms in the day, in the moment, not with the history, not trying to relive it or rework it. That happens as part of the work anyway, most often, but we used to focus on that. The next part, of course, is negative alterations in cognitions and mood. So depression, PTSD is an anxiety disorder to start with, right? You need to have 2 of these. You also will have an inability to recall key features, right? And you'll have persistent negative beliefs and expectations about oneself or about the world. So you may be thinking the world's dangerous if it was a car accident. If you were sexually abused, you may think that men or women are dangerous, depending on who abused you. This results, obviously, in great relationship problems. Now, there's some exclusion criteria which you can look at the DSM and figure out, including depersonalization, derealization, things along those lines. And one of the things that's also been clarified in the new DSM is the dissociation clarify if you have dissociation. About 40%, 50% of the kids that have been sexually abused, that are sex offenders, have dissociation. One of our questions, and we're about to test it in a new study, is to see if they're offending while dissociating, because that may be part of what's happening. They may be working out an unconscious problem through offending, through acting out. PTSD symptoms in children are fascinating, and that PTSD was first recognized in World War I with shell shock. And then in World War II, we started to recognize it more clearly. But in the 60s, 70s, people started to talk about it, particularly in children in South America and the various wars that were occurring there. And then in the 80s, Ethan Pinu started to talk about it, and they recognized a number of things. They started to call it post-traumatic stress disorder, right? And the things that they've seen are frequently hyper-response or under-response. Now listen to this pattern: anger or depression, anxiety or depression, suicidality, sexualized behavior and aggression, externalizing and internalizing, withdrawing and depression. Again, all these things, depending on which study you've looked at, they're counters. It's like you sleep too much, you sleep too little, you eat too much, you eat too little, you get too angry, you don't get angry enough, you get depressed, you get aggressive. It's very hard to diagnose. It comes across very differently in different people. Males tend to be more externalizers than internalizers in general, but not always. So that's one differences that we see in the gender. One of the other things that's been fascinating in looking at PTSD is the damage to the brain. The locus coeruleus, which is in this part of the brain, the animal part of the brain down here, is damaged, and frequently only 50% of the size it should be after someone experiences post-traumatic stress disorder. This is the fight or flight center of the brain. It's the part of the brain that gets activated before anything else when you get scared. It's the part of the brain that tells you, I need to fight, or I need to run, I need to do something because I'm panicked, I'm experiencing something terrible, I need to take care of myself. And if it's only half its size, it doesn't work very well. So people misread cues, they respond when they shouldn't, they overreact, they underreact, they put themselves at greater risk or are too afraid to go out the door. That's what PTSD begins to look like in a number of people. Other parts of the brain are also affected, including the hippocampus, the front cingulate. There are several different parts of the brain that are reduced in size and function as a part of having post-traumatic stress disorder. The neural damage, as I mentioned, is mostly at the base of the brain. This is important to understand because this is the part of the brain that gets activated by senses coming from the body, right, including the eyes. So all information goes through the base part of the brain before it goes up into the gray matter, where you can try to do something about that panic or that fear or that anxiety. It all starts down here, so in the animal part. So in other words, before you can think your way through it, you're reacting. Emotions always come before thoughts. It's just milliseconds, by the way, but emotions always come before thoughts because it's the emotional function of the brain that happens before the intellectual part of the brain. So I'm gonna put up a factor model, and you can see it on the slides you've got there. First, you've got a stimulus that sets you off. And then this is an easy way to understand trauma. The second box that is down below is the meaning of it, the structure, the memory perhaps of childhood trauma happens. This leads to hyperarousal and to bodily reactions. You'll have a faster heart rate. You'll start to breathe faster. You'll start to perspire. And this, of course, leads to numbing and avoidance. You want to get rid of that. So the model for a long time has been this: stimuli, meaning comes up. What does it mean to me? What am I afraid of? What are those feelings I had? And then hyperarousal and re-experiencing with intrusive thoughts, feelings, memories, even visions, and then numbing and avoidance. Right? So let's take a kid. Right? Let's take John. John was sexually abused by a guy who looked like me, his dad. All right? So I walk up to him, and I am generalized stimuli. I'm not specific. I'm not his dad. His dad would be the specific stimuli. I'm generalized stimuli. I walk up towards him, and all of a sudden, kind of welling up through the emotional part of his brain is this fear, this abject terror he has. I've seen this happen in clients sometimes. They start to run away or back away. I don't know what's going on, and we can't tell until we look at the picture of their dad, who happens to be my height and have brownish, blondish hair, And then the kid is re-experiencing the trauma. He starts to remember being touched, being hurt, having negative feelings. He starts to think about what happened to him and the helplessness he felt when he was a little child, and he regresses to that point in life where maybe he feels like a 5-year-old and he had no power to do anything to get out of it. So he will then do anything to avoid it. Dissociation, we see a lot of that in our clients, right? Numbing of any sort or type, substance abuse frequently, okay? Hypersexual behavior to try to kind of get rid of it through the sexual behavior, all kinds of things happen. The recent addition to this model, particularly in the 2000s through King and Asmundsen and others, is this new module I'm going to bring up now in the slides, which is physiological responses, which seem to come before or with the meaning. We've now recognized biologically that as soon as you see the stimuli, because of the location of the locus coeruleus in the base part of the brain, you have physiological responses before you're even aware that you're reacting to the stimuli. So if someone's had a bad car accident, and that's not the best example because many people have and they can be quite serious, but if they had a bad car accident and they hear that sound, that terrible sound of squealing of brakes, all of a sudden their heart's racing. It can accelerate from a standard resting of 65 beats per minute to 130 in less than a second. Just instant acceleration. And then they can't breathe and they're hyperventilating. It's a very terrible feeling. Now think about what I'm saying about John. John has you in therapy and you're talking to him about his trauma. All of a sudden his heart rate accelerates. All of a sudden he starts to perspire. All of a sudden his breathing starts to go fast. And all of a sudden his adrenaline kicks in. He wants to hit, strike, move, avoid, run like hell. This is why we no longer talk about the trauma or regress kids into re-experiencing that trauma. Now instead, we talk about the current effects of the trauma. Okay? So the physiological responses come up along with the meaning, then the hyperarousal, the re-experiencing, the intrusive thoughts, then the numbing and avoidance as a natural reaction, a healthy reaction, a defense to those experiences. That's the current model of post-traumatic stress disorder, as we see looking at meta-analyses and looking at study after study and studying psychiatric data. So one of the models is that a kid has post-traumatic stress disorder, he gets all aroused by stimuli, and he doesn't know what to do with it. In order to numb or avoid it, he wants to face his fears by sexually abusing someone. Right? He wants to numb through arousal and through orgasm. Right? He wants to try to work this out in some way to make sense of it, so he acts out. Another model is by Ray Knight, which is another kind of trauma model, and this is a factor analysis with a structural equation model. So in this graph with all the yellow circles, I've taken out the statistics because frankly they're a little overwhelming, okay? But all of the little arrows are significant. So if you look at the model, you can see that all the kids in his data were either physically or verbally abused, that's the top circle, or sexually abused. Every single kid in his data were either physically or verbally abused or sexually abused. The rates of sexual abuse is about 50%, by the way, for sex offending youth. Let's go along the top model then. They're either physically or verbally abused, and then you just follow the arrows. They become antisocial, and they have antisocial behavior and aggression. This leads to sexual coercion, or they become callous and unemotional, they become depersonalized, they become dissociative, and this can lead to antisocial behavior and then to sexual coercion, or can lead to aggressive sexual fantasy and then sexual coercion. Along the bottom path, they're sexually abused, this leads to sexual fantasy, usually negative sexual fantasy, and then to aggressive sexual fantasy, and this leads to sexual coercion. Models like this are interesting. Not every kid fits, but a lot of them do. These are all significant correlations where all the arrows lie. Okay, it's a good fit model. If you look at all the Wilks lambda and all the different statistics used to determine it, and Ray and Judith Sims-Knight continue to work on these models and try to shape up. This is the best statistical model we have of the causes of sexual abuse based on large data sets so far. This is another model. This is one I've been working on for some time and wrote up with William Mizan a number of years ago. And it's a little more social working and contextual. So we have learning experiences on the left side of the slide, right? And sexual victimization, physical victimization, lawlessness in the family, socialization, a number of variables that happen to children when they're quite young. All these things would relate to one another. This leads to mediators or moderators. Mediators and moderators either make things worse or make things better. So, for example, if a youth has a strong, resilient personality, then his learning experiences, he may be able to mitigate those or make them a little better, have them not act out in behavior. If he has a negative personality or problematic personality, such as antisocial personality disorder or conduct disorder, then this may lead to more problematic behaviors. And the same thing with social cognition. Social cognition is about how do we communicate with people, how do we understand people, how do we work with people. If a youth is able to get his needs met, his emotional needs from friends, from his family, from loved ones, then he may not feel he has a need to meet those needs inappropriately. If he has inappropriate social cognition or poor social skills is what that works out to, he may meet them inappropriately. And sex offenders, again, are about 50-50 on that, okay? Then we have exacerbating factors. A lot of the kids use drugs. About half of sex offenders in the data sets I've got commit sex crimes and non-sexual crimes. We call them sex offenders plus. And those sex offenders plus kids use more drugs than their delinquent counterparts in the same facilities, okay? And they do more of every other crime, as a matter of fact. They are worse at carjacking, burglary, armed robbery, everything you can imagine. They do that more severely than their delinquent counterparts. And if they do these other crimes, there's a certain set of pathways then that lead them to law breaking and rule breaking, to rape, potentially to sexual abuse by hanging out with their delinquent peers, okay? There's also all forms of, other forms of criminality lead the same way. Then as adolescent comes in,